Hi. So today we are going to be looking at Matthew chapter 22, and we are going to read together quite a large chunk and then focus in on just one section of it. As you read through the passage, you'll notice that it's full of questions of different people asking Jesus a series of questions that might seem a bit strange or a bit unusual to us today. And these people that are asking the questions from the Jewish faith, so some of them are Jewish leaders, Jewish religious leaders, people from all different parts of the faith. So they share that common faith together, they share that common perspective, but the reality is that they disagree on key parts of it, on the nuances of it and the detail of that. So for us today, it's probably a little bit like you've got a gathering of different Christian leaders, different church leaders from different parts of the church, and they're meeting together and discussing some of those more controversial parts of faith that they might not all agree on. So as I said, the content of the questions might seem a little bit strange for us on the face of it. But as we read the passage, I'd encourage you to be thinking about what those questions are and what the meaning behind the questions is, the intent of them at the heart of them. We'll be focusing particularly on the question about Caesar and taxes, so do pay particular attention as we read that together. So let's pause now and read the passage out loud together. There are 4 questions, so you could split it out and have a different person read each chunk of them. So, what did you think of the questions? This is one of those times where I think it's quite hard to understand exactly what's going on without the nuance of what's happening in that cultural context and the meaning behind that. The first thing I noticed when I looked at the passage was that they were intending to trap Jesus in his words, that the questions they were asking were meant to be difficult or controversial for him to answer. The questions are being asked by fellow Jewish people, so I was a bit surprised by their desire to trip Jesus up over seemingly small details of the faith and culture that they ultimately all share. This becomes more complex when you better understand exactly who is asking the questions. So as we look at the question about taxes and Caesar, you'll see that the question was asked by Pharisees and by the Herodians. The Pharisees are the ultra-conservative religious group. They were very traditional and they thought it was really important to follow all the fine details of the law, often creating even more strict rules just to avoid any possible risk of breaking the biblical law at all. However, on a number of occasions already, Jesus points out that by being so focused on the letter of the law, the detail of the law and the rules, they might sometimes miss the greater meaning behind it and the sense about why they're in place in the first place. What's important here is that the Pharisees were not supportive of the Roman Empire, and they took particular issue with this tax that we're discussing, which we'll discuss a bit later more, but essentially because the tax had to be paid with a coin that had the face of Caesar on it. The Herodians, on the other hand, were supporters of King Herod, and because Herod's power was provided by the Roman Empire, so was theirs. And so they were often in a bit of opposition with the Pharisees because they supported the rule of the Roman Empire and wanted to be in line with that and to follow that because it gave them their status, where the Pharisees disagreed because they thought it made them do things that were outside of the law they believed. All this means that it was really unusual for them to be working together, and would make us think maybe there's an ulterior motive here, maybe there's something else behind the reason that they've come together to ask Jesus questions. So let's take a look at the question that they ask. So they say, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" So when I first looked at this passage, I found it quite hard to understand why the questions about whether the Jewish people should pay their taxes to the Roman Empire, or, even if marriage lasts through to the resurrection, were kind of the key big questions that were important at that time and for my life. What do they mean for my life today? But when I stop to think about the broad themes of the questions, they are still quite relevant today. The question about taxes is really about how we interact with the government. About marriage and the resurrection is really about what happens after you die. The greatest commandment is a question about the important guidelines to how we live our lives. And the final question is all around who is God and what does that mean? But in coming back to this specific question that we're looking at, the opening is really long and full of flattery. The question itself is quite short and to the point, and seemingly just needs a yes or no answer. For a bit of context to help us understand, as I said earlier, the Jewish people paid a number of different taxes, but this particular tax stood out as it was a set amount for all adults, and it had to be paid with a silver Roman coin, and this coin had the image of the emperor and had the words Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus on them. So generally, the Jewish people weren't in favour of paying the Roman taxes anyway, particularly because the taxes funded the empire that was occupying their land. But this tax in specific was particularly controversial for them because the coin that it had to be paid with had the image of Caesar on it. And Caesar claimed to be the son of a god and generally saw himself as having godlike status. And so there was a real issue for them, and particularly for the Pharisees, that they were having to pay this tax using a coin that claimed that somebody else was God. The Herodians, on the other hand, felt that they should just pay the tax because that's what you were asked to do and that's what you should do. And so this meant that when Jesus answered the question, he had a tricky situation on his hands. If he says, pay the tax, then the Jewish people generally are going to be a bit put out by that. But also, so would the Pharisees, because there's a question over the whole image of God and someone else claiming to be a god. But if he says don't pay the tax, the Herodians are not going to be happy, and they're likely to report him to the Roman authorities, and that would cause big problems. So as you can see, it's a bit of a difficult situation. Either answering yes or no could put him in some real trouble, and put some of the community against him. So let's see what Jesus said in response. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription is this?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. Jesus' answer is insightful as he answers not just the question, but the hidden questions behind it too. He doesn't just say, yes, pay the tax, but he explains to them that he understands what they're trying to do. He calls them out for trying to trap him, calls them hypocrites for putting him in this position. But he also clearly answers a question that the Pharisees have about using the image of Caesar, that he knows is at the heart of the question as well. He asks them that exact question about the image on the coin and then says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," rounding off that in that scenario, paying the tax, pay that tax, use that coin, but then moves us on to what is the more fundamental question, the more key part here, and something that we might quite easily miss in our understanding of what's going on, and that he goes beyond just answering the question and gives an answer that was likely to be even more provocative to the people who were asking it. When he says, "Give to God what is God's," that brings in the idea that humans are the image bearers of God. The Pharisees and the Herodians have asked a question about a coin having the image of Caesar on it and what to do. And he brings it back to us as humans bearing the image of God, and what does that mean for us? So it's a provocation to give our whole selves to God. The real controversy here isn't about what to do with a particular tax and a particular coin, but that what God calls us to do is to give our full selves to him. And that's what leaves the crowd amazed. So we're going to spend some time now in groups discussing this and discussing what we've been looking at in the passage today. So there'll be a few different questions on the screen. There's about 5 split into sections, and you can pick which ones feel most suitable for your group to be answering. So there's a couple about big questions. What are the questions that we have for God? What are the questions that our friends and family who don't know him have? And how do we feel about answering those and bringing those to God? There's a bit about money where you can talk about where you give money to, if you do give money. How do you feel about money? How does that play into a sense of you giving everything you have to God, and worship and all of that? So I'd encourage you to kind of look at those and see which ones feel best for your group to be answering. But I'd like if all of us could then look at the question about image and about being image bearers of God and what that means as we come into this year. The question is around what it means to take some steps to move more into that idea of giving our whole selves to God and being made in his image. So take a look at the questions, pick the ones you want, but do have a look at that question around the image of God and giving your whole self to him, and then pray into that at the end. And I'll see you later, GT. Thanks.